Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we are going to be looking at a very simple improvement that I made to the merchant here. If you remember from the past video, we had the merchant cycling through a very simple cycle of animation. If you haven't seen that video, I definitely recommend you go see that because that contains a lot of the logic that we'll be seeing here. But without further ado, first let's start by seeing the finished product. Okay, so we're here in VR. As you remember, since we're using virtual desktop to hook the Quest to Unity, this is going through SteamVR. And in SteamVR, for whatever reason, the first time you load the scene, no hands, but then you restart the scene and the hands appear. Great. So now we have the merchant here, and you may have noticed, but we've been in the scene for a while, and the merchant is just sitting around here. If you remember from the past video, he was cycling through the animation, but now he's actually just sitting around until we come in and then pull the hand trigger and then interact with the merchant. Now it stands up. Let's interact with the merchant. We're here. We're going to sell some items. As you remember, click sell. It's actually sell one, so you see everything's still working. Bam, we sold a log to the merchant. Now the merchant, inside his inventory, he's going to have a log, and I have one log less, and now I have 10 gold more. Cool, we finished the transaction. Now, if I close the dialog, the merchant goes back to sitting. And he'll sit around for as long as we leave him there. We come back, interact with him again, stands up, we are ready for more transactions, we keep selling, finish our transaction, close the dialog, and the merchant goes back to sitting. Great. So that's what we have today. That's the main thing. How to control the animations for the merchant. If you remember, you may have seen this sneak preview before in the last video. This is the animator setup for the merchant. We have 4 states. First state, the default state, is just sitting, what you saw. Then there's a stand-up animation going from sitting to standing. Then we have an idle standing animation. This is when you're interacting with the merchant. Again, he's just standing around, but he's standing. And then when you finish the interaction, goes to a kneel down animation, and then from there goes back to sitting. So you may notice here on the left, we have a couple of parameters here. Stand up and sit down. They're pretty straightforward. When you're in the sitting idle state of the animation, I removed here the has exit time checkbox so that it doesn't transition out of the animation. It just loops around the sitting idle animation. But when the stand up trigger is triggered, then we do the transition to stand up. And then this is the standing animation, and then from that just naturally exits into the idle standing animation. So once the merchant finishes standing up, then he's just gonna stand around. And here's the important part. This transition as well doesn't have an exit time. It has a condition. So unless the sit down trigger is triggered, the merchant will just stay standing there. But when the sit down trigger gets triggered in the animator, then we go through the kneel down animation. And this one has an exit time. And then it just, once the kneeling down animation finishes, we are back in sitting idle, and then the sitting idle animation will just loop around until we interact with the merchant again and then trigger that condition of standing up. And round we go in this cycle. So how do we trigger the merchant standing up and sitting down? Well, we do have the interactable script, which has the onInteract Unity event. And there seems the perfect place to put it, because this is where we are enabling the cell UI, is shown here behind the merchant. And at the same time, we want to trigger the animator with a stand-up trigger so that the merchant stands up. So that gets us halfway through there. This is the perfect place to have the merchant stand up. The next one is a little bit trickier because we want to trigger that when we close the panel here, when we close the cell UI. That's the main way to trigger this. We will later need to see for different cases. For example, right now, you can still move around when you're interacting with the merchant. Maybe we stop the character controller so you cannot move around, or if you can still move around, then the main thing will be to have sort of like an interaction radius. And if you leave the interaction radius, then automatically the interaction finishes and the merchant goes back to idle. But we haven't set that up yet. Currently, we're just waiting for the transaction to finish, and then when we hit the close button here, this tiny button, here you can see it a little bit closer. When we hit the close button here, then we want the merchant to sit down. So naturally we go to the close button here in the cell UI. And in there we have an on-click event, and we trigger the sit down trigger here and on the animator. To set this up, we just simply drag the model here that we have with the model with the animator into the Unity event, and that works. And then we set the sit down trigger. And one thing that was happening is that as soon as the merchant would sit down, he would immediately stand up again. Now I haven't looked into that, but my intuition is that the stand up trigger was still getting set, maybe because the input to trigger the close button is the same input as the interactor input. If you remember here in the player, we have the interactor, which has an interact input, and this is the primary and secondary trigger here. And that is the same input that we're using here for triggering the UI helper, so primary and secondary. So one thing that we could do that I haven't implemented yet is that when the UI is enabled, the merchant interactable script is disabled, and then whenever we end up disabling or finishing the UI interaction here, then we re-enable that. And that could be an interesting solution for this. For now, simply resetting the stand-up trigger here on click has prevented the merchant from standing up right away when it finishes sitting. So for now, I'm just leaving it like that. But this is the main thing. If you can see here, if you stuck around for other videos, you may be surprised that there's no code involved in here pretty much at all. And that is because we've been setting up things properly. We have set these Unity events that are very powerful in kind of wiring behavior without code. They can be a tricky system to use sometimes because there's limitations to what you can serialize in the Unity events, and you have to be careful about how you couple things here in the editor, because this is basically a dependency injection pattern. So you have to be aware of the limitations of that and any caveats there, depending on your design. But for now, because we have set these things up properly before, we can just drag a few things here, set up, add a trigger here in the animator and give them some names, then drag the prefab or the component here, the game object here that has the animator in it, and then just drag that into whatever Unity event we need, and then set the trigger right there. Pretty straightforward, dragging things in, selecting the right thing, adding some variables, and that's it. That's all that we needed to add in order for us to have the better animation cycle that is actually responsive to the player interactions instead of just cycling around, which was pretty weird. The merchant standing and sitting on his own for no reason. That is basically it. This was a short one because we have set things up properly in the past, so naturally this has helped. Stick around for the next video. I hope to see you then. We'll be tackling a few more things with the merchant, and then we'll go on to setting the rest of the project. Thank you for sticking around, and I'll see you in the next one.